What happens when the world you've always known suddenly disappears? For Tommy, the answer came in the form of a letter. The factory where his father had worked for nearly 30 years was closing down, and with it, their life as they knew it. The factory wasn't just a place where John, Tommy's father, worked, it was the heart of their home. John had spent decades in those gritty, humming halls, working long hours, sacrificing everything to provide for his family. The factory was stability, it was purpose. It was where John's sweat, blood, and time went into building something that could give his son a better life. And Tommy, though young, knew the rhythm of it all, the machines, the smells of oil, the sound of his father's heavy boots on the factory floor. This was home. But that all changed the day Tommy found the letter. The ink on the paper was stark, cold, a closure notice. The factory, the very foundation of their lives, was shutting down. It felt like the ground had slipped out from under him. Tommy's heart dropped, and he looked up to his father for answers. John's face, usually so steady, was now shadowed with something Tommy had never seen before: defeat. John had always been strong, a rock, the one who made everything feel safe. But now, he seemed smaller, unsure. His life, everything he had worked for, was slipping through his fingers. "Dad, what's going to happen?" Tommy's voice cracked, barely above a whisper. John didn't respond right away. His eyes were distant, staring at nothing in particular, as though the world around him had just turned upside down. "We'll find a way," he said, but even to Tommy, the words felt empty. They were just words, promises he didn't believe. John had poured so much into this factory. He had built friendships here, learned every tool and machine inside and out, and hoped, year after year, that his hard work would lead to something more. But now, after all these years, the factory was being shut down. The promises of a future, of security, had been shattered. Tommy's world felt smaller as he watched his father. What would they do now? Where would they go? The days that followed were filled with uncertainty. The factory workers, men and women who had dedicated their lives to the company, stood with their heads down, defeated. Tommy could see the sadness in their eyes. His father wasn't the only one crumbling under the weight of the news. John, though strong, wasn't immune. He'd always kept his head high, always tried to shield Tommy from the world's harsh realities. But now, he couldn't even shield himself from the truth. Every day, he came home more tired, more withdrawn. Tommy could see the quiet despair in his father's eyes. The factory wasn't just his job, it was his identity. But Tommy wasn't ready to give up. He couldn't let this be the end. One evening, after his father had returned home, tired and broken, Tommy sat at the kitchen table. His mind raced. What could he possibly do? What could a 12-year-old do to save his father's world? That's when the idea hit him. A letter. Tommy quickly grabbed a piece of paper and wrote a message to the CEO of the company. He knew that the man at the top didn't care about the workers, he saw them as numbers, not people. But Tommy was determined. If he could make the CEO see the value of this factory, see the lives it had touched, maybe there was a chance. As he wrote, Tommy's mind wandered to the faces of the workers, his father's friends, the people who depended on this place. He thought about the empty factory floors, the lifeless hallways, and the looks of resignation on the workers' faces. But then, his thoughts shifted. No, he wouldn't let it end like this. He had to try. He folded the letter and placed it in an envelope. He knew it was a long shot, but it was all he had. The next day, Tommy gathered the children of the workers. He didn't know how it would work, but he told them his plan. Together, they would all write letters. Maybe if they could show the CEO what the factory meant to them, he would change his mind. As Tommy watched his father come home that evening, still carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders, he made a promise to himself: he wouldn't let his father lose everything without a fight. The factory wasn't just a building. It was their life. And Tommy was going to do whatever it took to save it. What if you had one chance to change everything for the people you love? Tommy knew this was his moment, his chance to make a difference, to save his family's future. The days dragged on, each one heavier than the last. The factory, once a place of pride, now felt like a ghost of its former self. John, Tommy's father, had always been a man of few words, but he had never been this silent. The loss of the factory weighed on him like 1,000 pounds. He still went to work every day, but the spark in his eyes was gone. His heart wasn't in it anymore. And Tommy could feel that, a suffocating weight that clung to their home, their lives. Tommy didn't fully understand the gravity of what was happening. How could he? He was only 12, still a child, still learning about the world around him. But what he did know was that this factory was the foundation of everything he had ever known. It wasn't just where his father worked, it was the pulse of their world. Without it, everything would change. And Tommy couldn't bear the thought of that. His father had always promised him that no matter what, they would be okay. But the promise felt empty now. John was too tired, too defeated to keep it alive. The loss of the factory wasn't just about their livelihood, it was the loss of a piece of who they were. But Tommy wasn't ready to give up. He couldn't sit back and watch his father fall apart. He had to do something. He had to try. One evening, after another long day, Tommy sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at a blank sheet of paper. His mind raced. What could he do? What could a 12-year-old boy possibly do to save something so big, so important? Then, like a spark in the dark, the idea hit him. He couldn't just sit there. He had to make the people in charge see what the factory meant to the community. If he could reach the CEO, maybe, just maybe, he could save them. Save his father. He began writing. Slowly, carefully, each word coming from his heart. He wasn't sure if it would make a difference, but he had to try. The letter to the CEO wouldn't be a plea for help, it would be a message about who the people in that factory really were. About the sacrifices they had made. About the lives they had built. The next day, he gathered the other children whose parents worked at the factory. They, too, were facing the same uncertainty, but none of them had dared to act. None of them had the courage to speak up. But Tommy was different. Tommy believed they could make a difference. He told the kids about his plan to write letters. Together, they could show the CEO what the factory meant to them. Maybe, just maybe, if they could make the man at the top understand, he'd change his mind. The other children were hesitant at first. Would their voices matter? What difference could they make? But Tommy's conviction was contagious. Slowly, they began writing. Each letter was personal, filled with the kind of raw emotion only children could express, simple, pure, heartfelt. Tommy, meanwhile, kept working on his letter. It wasn't perfect, but it came from the heart. He poured his love for his father, for the workers, into every word. He wrote about the sacrifices, the years of hard work. He wrote about his father, the man who had given everything to this factory. And then, the moment came. The letters were ready. It was time to deliver them. Tommy made arrangements to meet with the CEO. He wasn't sure how it would go, but he had to try. He couldn't let his father lose everything without a fight. The day of the meeting, Tommy felt a mix of fear and determination. His palms were sweaty, his heart pounding. As he walked through the factory gates, he felt like he was walking into a battle. The factory, once a place of pride, now seemed to hang in the balance. The workers still came, still clocked in, but the life had drained from the place. The sound of the machines, once so comforting, now felt like a constant reminder of what was being lost. Tommy's nerves were on edge. He could feel the weight of his father's hope resting on his shoulders. He couldn't let his father down. He couldn't let the workers down. He held the envelope tightly as he entered the CEO's office. The man who ran everything. Robert. Cold. Calculating. Tommy wasn't sure if he could change anything, but he had to try. Robert barely looked up as Tommy entered. His gaze was distant, businesslike. But Tommy wasn't intimidated. He walked forward, holding the envelope out in front of him, his voice shaky but steady. "This is for you," he said. "Please read it." Robert took the envelope without a word and began to read. For a brief moment, Tommy thought he saw a flicker of something, maybe curiosity, maybe skepticism, but it was gone almost immediately. Robert's face was blank, his posture stiff. Tommy watched him, waiting. His heart was in his throat, and for a moment, time seemed to slow. What if this didn't work? What if it was all for nothing? Then, Robert looked up, his face still impassive. He placed the letter down on the desk, his eyes scanning Tommy's face, but he didn't say a word. Tommy's mind raced. What now? Had he done enough? Was this really going to make a difference? The room was silent, but Tommy held his ground. His father's future, his family's future, was on the line. And he wasn't going to give up. Not yet. Even if the odds seemed impossible, Tommy knew one thing for sure: he had to try. Sometimes, the biggest battles don't take place in boardrooms or with the loudest voices. Sometimes, they happen in silence, in quiet moments of resolve. Tommy hadn't expected the meeting with the CEO to be easy. But he didn't expect it to feel like such a defeat, either. Robert, the CEO, had listened to him with barely a flicker of interest, scanning the letter Tommy had written with cold indifference. The man's response was as expected: dismissive, uninterested, detached. The factory was closing, and nothing could change that. It wasn't personal. It was business. The words stung, leaving Tommy standing there, feeling small and powerless. He had poured his heart into that letter, hoping it would spark something in Robert, but instead, all he'd received was a brush-off. Walking out of that office, Tommy felt the weight of failure pressing down on him, threatening to crush him. The factory, the lifeblood of his family, was slipping away, and there was nothing he could do about it. As he walked back through the factory floor, past the workers who were once so full of pride, he could see the toll the news had taken on them. There was no laughter now, no camaraderie. The place felt hollow, the machines silent, as if the factory itself had already given up. His father was there, talking in hushed tones with some of his colleagues, their shoulders slumped, their faces worn. The weight of the news had become too much for them to carry. Tommy's heart ached as he saw his father, his rock, his protector, standing there, looking more broken than he had ever seen him. John had always been the one to carry the family, to shield Tommy from the harshness of the world, but now, he looked lost. Tommy wanted to do something, anything, to take that burden off his father's shoulders, but the words didn't come. What could he say? How could he fix this? That night, after dinner, Tommy found himself lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. The factory's hum, once so familiar, now felt distant in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness that had settled in his chest. The letter hadn't worked. The CEO hadn't listened. His father was still losing everything. But then, as the hours passed and the stillness of the night enveloped him, something stirred inside Tommy. He couldn't just lie there and give up. He wouldn't. His father had never given up on him, not once in his life, and Tommy wasn't about to let everything they'd built fall apart without a fight. The next morning, he went to his father and, for the first time, spoke with a sense of conviction. "Dad," Tommy said, his voice firm but shaking, "I'm not going to let this happen. We can still save the factory." John looked at him, a mixture of surprise and sadness in his eyes. "Tommy, I don't know what to tell you. This isn't something we can fix. This is out of our hands." But Tommy wouldn't accept that. "It's not out of our hands, Dad. We still have a chance. I'm going to do whatever it takes to make them see. I'm not giving up." John sighed, his face lined with worry. "Sometimes, no matter how hard we try, things don't work out the way we want them to." Tommy shook his head, determination building inside him. "I don't care. We've worked too hard for this. We can't just let it end like this." His father fell silent, then placed a hand on Tommy's shoulder. "I don't know what you're planning, but you'd better be careful. The people at the top, they don't care about us. They won't listen." But Tommy wasn't going to let that stop him. He knew his father was right. Robert had made it clear that he didn't care about the workers. But what if they could show him what the factory really meant? What if they could make him understand that this wasn't just a business, it was a community, a family? Over the next few days, Tommy kept working quietly. He met with the children of the workers again, and together, they began to plan. They would write more letters, yes, but this time, it would be different. They would go further. They would show Robert what the factory meant to them, not just with words, but with action. Tommy knew it wouldn't be easy, but he also knew that the time for pleading was over. It was time for something more. It was time for the workers to stand up, together, and demand what was rightfully theirs, a chance. He went back to the factory, his heart pounding as he walked through the now quiet halls. He could hear his father's voice in his head, the doubts, the fears. But he pushed them aside. This wasn't just about saving a building, it was about saving everything they had. Everything they had worked for. Tommy's plan was simple, but bold. He would rally the workers, rally their families, and make one final stand. They would stage a protest, a peaceful one, but a protest nonetheless. They would not leave the factory until they had been heard, until they had shown Robert that the workers were not just numbers. They were people. And they weren't going to let their lives be discarded so easily. That evening, Tommy stood in the middle of the factory floor, his heart racing. He could see his father in the distance, looking worn but still standing strong. Tommy took a deep breath. He wasn't going to fail. Not this time. One by one, the workers gathered around, their faces filled with uncertainty, but also something else, something Tommy hadn't seen in weeks. A spark of hope. The workers knew what was at stake. They knew they had one chance, one last shot to make a difference. Tommy felt his father's presence behind him, a silent support, and he knew that no matter what happened, they were in this together. The protest had begun. What happens when the courage to stand up becomes the most powerful weapon in the fight for your future? Tommy had sparked a fire, and now it was spreading. The factory was buzzing with activity, but this time, it wasn't the sound of machines that filled the air. It was the sound of voices, of workers, of children, of families coming together to fight for everything they had. Tommy stood at the center of it all, his heart racing, his pulse quickening with every passing second. This was it. The protest was happening, and there was no turning back now. The workers, the people who had spent decades of their lives building the very foundation of the factory, were standing together, their faces a mix of determination and fear. Tommy could see the unease in their eyes. They were all scared. Scared of losing their livelihoods, scared of being abandoned by the very company they had given their lives to. But there was something else, too, a sense of solidarity, of unity. They were fighting not just for jobs, but for their dignity, their futures, and their families. John, Tommy's father, was among them. Though Tommy could see the exhaustion on his face, there was also something else, something that had been missing for weeks. A flicker of hope. Tommy had given him that, whether his father knew it or not. "Tommy," John said, walking over to him, his voice low and filled with concern. "What are we doing here? We can't keep doing this. It won't change anything." But Tommy didn't back down. "We have to try, Dad. We can't just let them take this from us. We've worked too hard for this." John's face softened, and for a moment, Tommy saw the man who had always been his protector, the man who had always carried the weight of their world on his shoulders. But even now, John didn't know if this protest could really change anything. The odds were against them. The system, the corporate machinery, it was all too powerful. But Tommy refused to believe that. They had one shot at this, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. As the protest continued, word started to spread. Some of the workers who had already accepted the factory's closure started to come around, joining in the stand. Others, like John, hesitated, unsure if this was the right path. But as the hours passed, the sense of unity only grew stronger. Tommy kept his eyes focused on the entrance to the factory, waiting. He had written countless letters, spoken to anyone who would listen, and now, it was time for the CEO to see them not just as workers, but as real people with families, with dreams, with futures that depended on this factory. Then, as if on cue, a sleek black car pulled up to the front gate. The workers fell silent. Tommy's heart skipped a beat. It was Robert, the CEO. He had come to see them, though not for the reason they hoped. He stepped out of the car, a cold look on his face, as his security team flanked him. Tommy's pulse quickened. This was the moment. "All right, everyone," Tommy said, stepping forward, his voice shaking but filled with a quiet strength. "This is it. We need to make them listen. We need to show them who we are." The workers gathered around, standing taller now, their voices growing stronger. "This is our home," one of them shouted. "We've worked here for years. You can't just take that away." Another worker joined in, his voice filled with emotion. "My family's been here since before I was born. You can't just erase that." Tommy stood beside them, feeling the power of their words in his chest. This wasn't just about jobs. This was about identity. This was about survival. And they weren't going to give up without a fight. Robert walked toward them slowly, his face unreadable, his eyes cold. He was used to controlling situations, used to making decisions that affected the lives of people without ever really seeing them. But now, he was confronted with a reality he hadn't expected. These weren't just employees to be let go. These were people who had built something real, something worth saving. Tommy stepped forward, his heart in his throat. This was his moment. He had one chance to make an impact, one chance to change Robert's mind. "Mr. Robert," Tommy said, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "this isn't just a factory. This is our home. This is where we've all built our lives. You can't just take it away from us like it doesn't matter." For a moment, Robert didn't respond. He stood there, his eyes scanning the workers, his security team standing just behind him. He looked at Tommy, his expression cold, distant. But Tommy saw something shift. It was subtle, a flicker of doubt, but it was there. Maybe he hadn't expected this. Maybe he hadn't expected to see real people, real families, standing in front of him, demanding to be heard. "I understand you're all upset," Robert finally said, his voice flat. "But this is a business decision. The factory is losing money. It can't survive. I'm sorry, but there's nothing more I can do." Tommy's heart sank. He had expected that. But he wasn't done yet. "Please, just listen," Tommy said, taking a deep breath. "We're not asking for handouts. We're asking for a chance. We've worked here for decades. We've given everything. We can save this factory. We just need a chance to prove it." For a long moment, there was silence. Robert stood still, his face unreadable. The workers waited, holding their breath, not knowing if they had won this small victory or if it was all for nothing. And then, just as the tension seemed unbearable, Robert spoke again, but this time, there was something different in his tone. "Fine," he said, his voice softening just a little. "I'll give you one chance. If you can show me a plan, something that makes sense, something that could work, I'll consider it. But you have to prove that the factory can turn around. It's the only way." Tommy felt a surge of relief rush through him. They weren't done yet, but this was the break they needed. It wasn't a victory, not yet. But it was a chance, a small window to save everything. "We'll do it," Tommy said, his voice full of resolve. "We'll show you." And with that, the protest began to shift from anger to hope. It wasn't over yet. But now, they had a chance to rebuild, to prove that the heart of the factory could still beat strong. And Tommy would be right there, fighting for it, every step of the way. When hope begins to fade, that's when the hardest work begins. The factory had never felt so alive. It was more than the hum of the machines now, it was the collective energy of a community that refused to let go. Tommy stood in the middle of it all, watching as the workers poured themselves into the task ahead. They had been given a chance 1 month to prove that they could turn the factory around, to show that the soul of the place wasn't lost, even if the business side was faltering. And now, every moment counted. John, though still weary from the past weeks of uncertainty, had found a renewed sense of purpose alongside his co-workers. The man who had once carried the weight of the factory alone now stood shoulder to shoulder with his fellow workers, sharing the load of change. There were no more conversations in whispers, no more silent acceptance. Together, they worked late into the night, restructuring, revamping, pushing themselves to the brink. Tommy hadn't left the factory since Robert's ultimatum. Each day, he watched his father and the others work tirelessly, transforming the factory into something that felt different, new, almost. The workers had begun to implement their plan, investing in more eco-friendly production methods, cutting waste, improving efficiency. They had made the place hum again, not just with machines, but with possibility. But Tommy knew this wasn't going to be easy. They were still racing against time. As the days slipped away, Tommy grew anxious. He saw the workers' exhaustion etched in their faces. They were giving everything they had, but deep down, Tommy couldn't shake the nagging doubt. Would it be enough? Would they be able to prove to Robert, and to themselves, that this factory was worth saving? Every day, Tommy stayed at the factory after school. He didn't go home, he stayed with the workers, organizing, ensuring that every task was done right. And as he watched his father work, his hands roughened by years of labor, his face more lined than ever, Tommy felt the weight of the world pressing down on him. His father had worked so hard for so long. How could they face the possibility of it all being taken away? But Tommy didn't allow himself to wallow in doubt. He couldn't afford to. He knew what was at stake. Every decision they made, every hour they worked, was a step towards saving the factory, towards saving the only life he and his father had ever known. In the final days leading up to Robert's decision, the workers worked with a quiet intensity, their sense of unity stronger than ever. The factory was no longer just a place of machines and assembly lines, it was a symbol of their resilience. Each worker, each child, each parent, was doing their part to give this place a future. Finally, the day came when Tommy and his father had done all they could. The factory had been restructured, the plan was in place, and now, they could only wait. The deadline was here. Robert arrived at the factory late that afternoon, his sharp gaze scanning the factory floor. He hadn't spoken to any of the workers since the protest, and now, Tommy felt his heart race as Robert's eyes locked onto him. Tommy stood tall, his hands clammy but steady. This was it. The moment that would decide everything. Robert didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I've seen the changes," he said, his tone still as cold as ever. "But actions speak louder than words. So, show me." Tommy led Robert through the factory, explaining each step of the plan. He showed him the new eco-friendly production methods, the cuts in waste, the improved efficiency. Robert didn't say much, but Tommy could see that his eyes lingered a bit longer on the improvements than before. Maybe, just maybe, there was something in this after all. Finally, Tommy brought Robert to the heart of the factory, where the workers had gathered. They stood there, quietly watching, as Tommy spoke. "This is more than just a place to work. This is our community. This is our home. We've given everything to this factory. And we're not giving up." Tommy's words hung in the air, the weight of them settling over the room. Robert stood still, his face unreadable, as the workers looked on expectantly. Tommy didn't know what Robert was thinking, but he could feel the tension in the room. This wasn't just about business anymore, it was personal. It was about dignity. It was about fighting for what you believed in. After a long pause, Robert spoke. "I don't know if this plan will work. But I'll give it a shot." Tommy's heart soared. It wasn't a full victory, not yet, but it was a chance. A chance to prove that their efforts weren't in vain. Robert hadn't committed fully, but he was willing to give them time. He would let the plan unfold. "We'll keep the factory open for another year," Robert said. "If you can show me results in that time, I'll consider further investment. But I won't promise anything beyond that." For the first time in weeks, Tommy felt the weight on his shoulders lift, if only a little. They had made it. They had earned one more year. It wasn't everything, but it was something. As Tommy walked away from Robert, he saw his father standing at the edge of the factory floor, watching him. There was no need for words. The relief in his father's eyes said it all. The factory had been given a lifeline, but now the real work began. There was no more time for second guessing. No more time for doubt. Tommy had done what he set out to do. He had sparked hope, and he had given his father and the workers a chance to reclaim everything they thought they had lost. In that moment, Tommy knew that the true victory wasn't in the decision that had been made, but in the strength they had found in each other. They were in this together, and together, they would rebuild. The future was uncertain, but it was theirs to shape now. When you fought for everything, you learn what really matters. The factory was no longer the quiet, uncertain place it had been in the past few months. There was a rhythm to the work now, a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. The workers, the children, the families, they were all part of something bigger now. They weren't just keeping the factory running, they were rebuilding it, piece by piece. Tommy watched his father closely, noticing how much lighter his steps seemed as he moved through the factory floor. It was as though the burden of the last few weeks had finally begun to lift. For the first time in a long time, Tommy saw the spark of hope in his father's eyes. John had always been a man of few words, but Tommy could see the pride in him now, pride not just in the work they were doing, but in how far they had come. And it wasn't just John. Every worker was now invested in this rebirth. Where there had once been fear and resignation, there was now energy and determination. The factory, the heart of their lives, was pulsing once more, and so were they. It was a new beginning, not just for the factory, but for all of them. But even with the factory turning a corner, Tommy knew that the real test was still to come. They had earned a second chance, but now they had to prove that they could sustain it. The next few months would be critical, and the pressure weighed heavily on everyone. Tommy was still running on the adrenaline of their small victory. But each day that passed brought its own set of challenges. The workers were pushing themselves to the limit. Even with the changes in place, they had to work twice as hard to prove that the factory could succeed in the new market. They were up against a system that had already written them off, and they had no choice but to fight. They were fighting for more than their jobs, they were fighting for their dignity, their community, their future. One afternoon, Tommy stood beside his father, watching as the factory hummed with activity. Workers moved efficiently from station to station, their faces determined, each person playing their part in the factory's revival. For a moment, Tommy just watched, taking it all in. It had been a long road to get here, but this was what it was all about. The heart of the factory had been restored, and with it, so had their hope. John glanced over at his son, noticing the look of quiet pride on his face. He nodded, almost imperceptibly. "You did it, Tommy," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You gave us all a chance." Tommy smiled, but the weight of everything they had been through hung in the air. "We all did it, Dad. This is our victory." John's eyes softened, and for the first time, Tommy saw something else, something he hadn't noticed before. It wasn't just pride. It was gratitude. "You've taught me a lot through all of this, Tommy," John said quietly. "You've shown me what it means to never give up, no matter how hard it gets. You gave me back something I didn't know I had lost." Tommy swallowed hard, feeling the lump in his throat. It had been a long road, but in that moment, he understood something deep within himself. This fight, the struggle, had been about so much more than saving a factory. It had been about finding something they had all lost: hope, unity, and the strength to fight for what they believed in. The months that followed were filled with both triumphs and setbacks. The factory didn't immediately become profitable, but they were making progress. Slowly, but surely, the workers' efforts began to pay off. The machines hummed more efficiently, and production levels steadily climbed. It wasn't easy, there were still days when it felt like they were climbing an insurmountable mountain, but they were climbing it together. And that, Tommy realized, was the key. It wasn't about perfection. It was about resilience. It was about fighting when it seemed impossible. And it was about never giving up on each other, no matter what. The community surrounding the factory also began to rally behind them. The workers' families, the children, everyone had a stake in the success of this place. It was no longer just a job, it was the lifeblood of their town. People were talking about it, encouraging others to support the factory, to buy the products they were making. Slowly, a sense of pride began to build around the factory once more. Tommy felt a deep sense of fulfillment as he watched the changes unfold, not just in the factory, but in the lives of everyone around him. He had started this journey as a boy, terrified that everything he knew was about to crumble. But now, he saw himself and his family in a new light. They had fought together, and they had found their strength together. They had saved their home, their community, and, most importantly, each other. One evening, as Tommy and his father walked outside the factory, they stopped for a moment to look at the building that had once seemed so uncertain. The lights were on inside, the sound of machines still humming, but now it felt different. It wasn't just a place of work anymore, it was a place of possibility. "Dad," Tommy said softly, "we did it." John nodded, his gaze lingering on the factory. "Yeah. We did." For the first time in what felt like forever, there was no uncertainty. No fear. Just pride. And hope. And a future that had been earned, step by step, by every person who refused to give up. The factory was no longer just a symbol of hard work. It had become a symbol of their resilience. A reminder that even when everything seems lost, it's never too late to fight for what matters. And for Tommy and his father, that meant everything.